Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on sustainable finance trends to watch this fall, hosted by Building Bridges. My name is Kaylee Taylor, and I'm the community manager here at Sustainable Finance Geneva. We are a proud founding partner of Building Bridges, and we wholeheartedly believe in its mission of bringing diverse stakeholders together to shape a sustainable finance future for everyone. As many of you know, the 4th edition of Building Bridges is set to kick off here in Geneva in just 11 days. So we really see this webinar as a warm-up to get us in the right headspace before the main event. For those of you who aren't so familiar with the initiative, Building Bridges is a global event that happens every year and brings together over 2,000 people from a variety of backgrounds, sectors, and regions to connect finance with sustainability. The 2023 edition is going to be taking place October 2nd to 5th here in Geneva, and it will feature a high-level summit, over 65 crowdsourced events, numerous networking opportunities, and much, much more. You can learn more about Building Bridges at the website that you see on the screen, and it's not too late to register, so I hope to see many of you there. You can also learn more about Building Bridges on our interactive app, which you will see here. You can scan that QR code. That has everything that's happening during the 2023 edition, and it will also give you an opportunity to connect with fellow members of the community, to make connections and build collaborations. So make sure to download that before you're on site at Building Bridges. Now, we only have an hour, so allow me to introduce you to our fantastic group of panelists that we have here today, starting with the Reverend Kirsten Snow Spalding, who is a vice president at Ceres and leads their investor network and all investor initiatives of the organization. We have Dr. Thomas Hohn-Sparborth, who is the head of sustainability research at Lombard Odier, and he leads a team focused on the transition to a circular, lean, inclusive, and clean economy. We have Dan Grandage, who is the head of sustainable investing at Aberdeen, where he supports their global investment business to protect and enhance performance by integrating ESG and sustainability throughout their investment processes. And finally, Christian Schills, who is the head of corporate responsibility at Vontobel, where he oversees the company's transition to sustainable development. If you do want to learn more about our speakers, their full bios can be found on the event page. And we're going to hear from all of our panelists in just 1 second. But before we get there, I did want to provide a super high-level overview of some of the trends that we have on our radar to kind of set the scene. And then we're going to see if those match up with what our speakers are experiencing in their own work. And one small housekeeping note before I dive into this first trend, and that's that you can feel free to use the Q&A feature that you see on the side, because we are going to have a chance to take questions from the audience near the end of the session. So let me dive quickly into the trends we're noticing at Building Bridges and here at Sustainable Finance Geneva. So we've noticed quite a shift this year in the rise of nature. As many of you know, 2022 wrapped up with an extremely important global event on nature, which was the COP15 for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which resulted in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Parallel to this, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures has been developing their recommendations, and just earlier this week in New York, they officially launched the framework. This has very much put nature on a higher part of the agenda for both businesses and investors. Maybe not quite as high as climate, but it's certainly gaining prominence. And this is only expected to continue as disclosure framework roll out and as more and more investors look to join alliances and initiatives that focus on nature. Unfortunately, in less positive news, the next trend we see is a continued growth of ESG backlash, particularly in the United States. Specifically, Republicans have been suggesting by writing letters to asset managers that acting on ESG could be violating antitrust laws, and they're threatening investigations into ESG-related antitrust violations. At the end of 2022, Republican members of the US House Judiciary Committee went so far as to announce that they were going to have an investigation into the members of the Climate Action 100 Plus. Now, while it's mostly threats at this point, the backlash has had some real impacts on net zero alliances, with some insurance, pension fund members, and asset management members dropping out, citing the potential legal risks. The next development, which is a little bit more positive again, is sustainable finance regulation, which continues to grow and develop all over the world. The European Union, who was a first mover, has implemented the second level of their SFDR technical standard at the beginning of this year, and we saw a lot of effects with this regulation. Particularly, we saw over 300 ESG funds be downgraded as it rolled out. The EU has now opened a consultation with the industry to further refine the classification rules to reduce confusion, and we expect this to happen in many regions where regulators are figuring out exactly what's going to work for the industry and for the objectives of the regulation. Taxomania, as we call it, which is the development of so many taxonomies, continues, with over 40 other countries following the EU's lead and developing their own sustainable finance taxonomies. And these diverse and varied approaches have very much enforced the need for standardization and interoperability, which is why the G20, central bankers, and many others have welcomed the International Sustainability Standards Board launch of their inaugural Global Sustainability Disclosure Standards. We continue to watch this space to see how all these varied approaches are going to come together globally for some sort of large, overarching, interoperable framework, hopefully. Now, another thing that we saw this year is that after many years of solid outperformance, ESG funds faced some mixed signals over the summer. While they continued to grow and attract capital generally, there were some outflows on sustainable funds in the US, which many attribute to the ESG backlash that I just mentioned a little bit earlier. In addition, this proxy season saw less support for ESG-linked proposals and an almost doubling of anti-ESG proposals. However, many experts in the field say that these numbers can be a little bit misleading because in actuality, the total number of ESG proposals put forward was much higher than in past years. Less proposals were withdrawn overall, and the proposals are becoming more sophisticated, so it's less likely that they're going to garner a majority of votes at every single AGM. And the final trend that I wanted to touch on is a little bit more in the realm of macroeconomics and public finance, but it has big implications for how capital is going to flow to emerging markets. And that's super important for building bridges as we really try and link the global north and the global south. And that is rethinking the global debt architecture. So this past June, Macron convened a summit for a new global financing pact to examine how we facilitate access of vulnerable countries to the financing they need. For those of you who don't know, many developing countries are currently facing a debt crisis, and they pay up to 5 times what developed countries pay to borrow. This systematically harms their economies and makes it harder for them to attract private capital. The Bridgetown Initiative is an initiative that's led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and they've put forward some really bold ideas to rethink this architecture more broadly and to create the conditions for capital flows for developing countries while also tackling sustainable development at the same time. So we're watching this space to see how this might affect the private finance space. So those are the big trends we've been tracking. And now I'm going to turn to our panelists, starting with Christian. And I want to ask, how do these line up with what you're seeing? Are there any trends missing? And which trend do you feel is the most pertinent to you at the moment? Please, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Callie. Well, I think I totally agree with basically the trends you just outlined. From my perspective, I would add the following. What I see is just when we look into our industry, I see still a rising awareness within the key players of our industry that, first of all, that sustainability is key, and there is basically to say no escape. So I see the trend that, first of all, they recognize that they have a role, first of all, from a more for their fiduciary kind of duty towards clients in terms of what are opportunities and risks when it comes to the transition to a more sustainable economy and society. And on the other side, I see quite of increasing or rising awareness. People realize, okay, we do have a role as a corporate citizen. And that is, how does the company, what is their share for the transition to a more sustainable economy and society? So that's quite important. I think that goes along with still an increasing demand for sustainable solution on the client side. Then I see a quite super evolving regulatory universe, you mentioned it, which is basically confronting us with a Byzantinic universe of different regulations in different jurisdictions. This is quite a challenge, especially for the medium or smaller members of our industry, because you need to be aware of the regulation, you need to understand it, you need to have the relevant resources in place, and basically the resources for disclosure too. So that's quite a challenge. Then this is like, we see a lot of noise around the greenwashing debate, which is quite important. And sure, the big topic is transparency. And I think transparency is, from my perspective, one of the most important factors in this whole debate. Because what we really need to do, we need to kind of be really quite frank what we can deliver, what could be our share in terms of this transition. We need to be honest, we need to be integer, and we need what we can do, and what we can do, we need to deliver, and we need to report. And if we are not able to comply with the regulation or not to comply fully with the regulation, we need to be really transparent about it. I think this is really key. This is a responsibility towards our key stakeholders. And that's because, for example, the Association of Swiss Wealth Management and Asset Management Banks is working with its priorities. Because what we said, okay, we need to say, what are our key levers as an industry to facilitate this transition? And then we need how we are progressing to deliver on these levers. That was one of the main reasons of the priority in sustainable finance of VAV and ABG. And then another one, which I see, is the net zero debate. Net zero is key. It has to do with climate, sure. And a lot of stakeholders now realize that if you kind of commit yourself to net zero, for example, 2050 or 2030, to a certain scope, that means really something. Yeah. And here we are confronted with quite a very tricky universe when it comes to definitions. What is the final definition of net zero? Is it SBTI? Is it from the UN climate framework? So if you promise something, you need to have a base, and that's a definition. And net zero here is quite a challenge. That's what I see when I should wrap it up right now.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Christian, for those insights. Kirsten, let's go over to you to reflect on if these match up with what you're seeing and which ones are most pertinent. Oh, sorry, you're on mute still.
There we go. I think you really did nail the top ones for me. Let me start by picking up on Christian's last point about transparency and the need for asset managers, asset owners to really be accountable to the commitments they've made, and for the companies in the portfolio to disclose in robust ways so that investors can use the information. What we're seeing is we've got a shift. It's gone from backwards looking data. You know, what did you do? Have you made progress towards a net zero commitment? What were your carbon emissions last year? What are they this year? To now investors and companies being asked, what are your plans? How are you going to meet the commitment? And so these investor climate action plans, we've seen many of our members issuing them either in pieces or as a whole document. And we're seeing in the engagements that they have between with their both public and private companies, they're asking for these plans and beginning to evaluate them and ask, you know, is the plan that you have in place going to meet the commitment you've made? Are you moving your money? What are your capital expenditures? Are you doing your lobbying aligned with the commitments you've made on climate or other issues? And I think that's a really important trend. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of others that you raised, Callie. The TNFD launch on Monday was fun. I was here, very exciting. And I really do think we'll see the disclosures around nature and biodiversity coming together with the disclosures on climate. You'll hear next week a new engagement initiative, NA100, really bringing investors together to ask those questions of companies in key sectors that have impacts on nature and biodiversity. Your note on the proxy season, I agree, there were very mixed signals, but I think that what we're seeing is not a backing away from commitments to climate, but rather a more nuanced conversation. Instead of seeing a point in time at the AGM when investors make the demand, now investors are engaged with companies year round. And we're seeing when proxy resolutions are filed, very often they're withdrawn because the companies are making commitments. So this is good news, not bad news, that they've been withdrawn. I think some of the ones that got lower votes, the largest asset managers told me they were just too prescriptive. We want to have these points in dialogue. We want to see these points in the plans, but the resolution process is not the right way to get there. It's a blunt instrument for a very fine and really nuanced strategy, company by company, sector by sector. So happy to talk more about the ESG backlash in a couple minutes, but those are all great points.
Thanks, Kirsten. Very nice nuances there that you've put on those points. Thanks for that. Thomas, let's go over to you. Same question.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much for your contributions so far, which I can only agree with. What I can add to that from my perspective is, I think, two things. I think the other trend that we're seeing is a bit of an evolution in mindset as to how we're thinking around sustainable finance. If we go back to the 90s, this was about negative screening and exclusions. In 2000s, we moved into the realm of ESG and best in class, and now we're in the realm or in the era where regulators are getting more involved. We need to meet those requirements. What we see a little bit as the next evolution in that stage, where we can see the seeds for that having been planted and starting to grow and awareness growing, is the recognition that this isn't just about meeting some of the expectations of our clients or doing our role as a corporate citizen, but that actually what all of this also involves is quite a profound transformation of the inherent structure of our economy, the actual characteristics of our economy. It involves shifts in value chains. It involves shifts potentially in asset allocation. And as soon as we start to understand that and start pulling that thread and understanding that this isn't just about a shift in value from fossil energy towards renewables, but actually involves quite profound coalitions, mergers, splits of major economic sectors. We see combinations or interactions between, for instance, the real estate and the utility sector. Once you start putting solar panel on rooftops, that starts to redefine the structure of the economy and the way certain sectors operate, and that has quite profound implications for how you allocate capital in this transition. I think the second trend that I would highlight is, well, aside from everything what's happening sort of introspectively in the world of sustainable finance, let's look outside as well at what's happening in the real world and in markets. In the real world, this transition is well underway. We've just been looking at the installation figures of renewable energy in H1, and they're well above expectations. They're a little bit behind expectations, I should say. In the US, we had a projection of 4 gigawatt hours of installations of wind in the US. It turned out to be 3. In China, we had a prediction of 14, and it turned out to be 23. If you add those numbers, yes, we're seeing some markets slightly lagging behind. We see the world as a whole racing ahead, which also creates interesting tension in markets because clean tech is not performing well in markets at the moment. For a variety of reasons, we've got high interest rate environments and various other factors that are affecting some of these thematics. But so I think we always need to think about sustainable finance in the context of how this is playing out in markets and also ultimately what's happening in the real world.
Perfect. Am I unmuted? There we go. Thank you so much, Thomas. I really like that link between the finance sector and the real economy. Sometimes I feel we don't make it enough. It's very important. Dan, over to you. Last but certainly not least, any reflections on these trends and how they line up with what you're seeing?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, everyone's perfectly summarized it. And pretty much every time I thought I was going to say something, someone else then stole my lines. No, I think your trends are spot on, and the additions and nuances that the other speakers have pulled out is absolutely right. One thing no one has mentioned actually, which I think is quite telling, is what we're starting to see is the effects of these things like climate change. We've all seen the wildfires, the crazy weather, etc., etc. That's starting to change the conversation now. It's not, the time of is climate change real or not is kind of moved on. The conversation has evolved, and I think that's the same with sustainability across the piece. That the whole conversation has evolved. The whole industry, if you like, has evolved and has matured. And I think all of your trends can be looked at under that kind of umbrella, that it's matured, it's more sophisticated, it's more nuanced. So the voting that Kirsten pulled out, that's because it's more nuanced. The votes that are being put forward are smaller but better written and more nuanced. And we realise that's not the only lever. We can't just rely on votes. We need to be in for the long term. We need to engage, and actually true engagement can take years. So you're not going to see that in these annual numbers. So that's evolved. I think the regulations you touched on as well. I know we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment, but I think that's transformational. The amount of regulation we got is just changing behavior. Certainly in my world, from a sort of asset manager, investment management, our portfolio managers are now really starting to not just tick the box and use the words, but it's affecting the way they're actually managing their assets, the way they're allocating, the way they're investing, and that's having a real world impact. To kind of Thomas's point as well, actually, that this is starting to have real world impacts, and I think that's what's happened, is we're moving through that, and that's also why we're getting the backlash, because it's having an impact, and it's there are some actors who are threatened by that or don't like that. So it's not that surprising, and you could say that the fact we're having a backlash means we're doing something right, I suppose, because people are paying attention now. So I think you've captured everything, yeah. So I think that's probably, in the interest of time, I'll pause there, because I know you're going to go in a bit more detail in a moment.
Thanks so much, Dan, and to all the speakers for those opening comments. I think this really, as I said, nuanced the points very well. Just want to remind the audience that you're most welcome to put some questions in the chat. We will come to those after my next set of questions, which I have one for each of my speakers. Let's start with Kirsten, who will take advantage of the fact that you're in the US and most of us are in Europe, but you're based there, and so you're seeing this ESG backlash kind of firsthand. Is what we're reading in the papers overblown? Are you concerned about some members dropping out of these net zero alliances? What is the broader response of the industry to what we kind of see as quite a worrying trend? Oh, mute again.
You would think that after 3 years of pandemic and many, many meetings on Zoom, we'd know to unmute ourselves. So we are certainly seeing all of the media about the ESG backlash. 157 pieces of legislation filed designed to restrict investors' ability to invest with the consideration of environmental, social, and governance factors. But with that many bills filed, we've seen 88 fail or been significantly shifted to improve investors' ability to consider these factors. I don't think the trend of really focusing on the most material, systemic, financial risks and opportunities to portfolios is going to change. My CEO and president, Mindy Luber, said yesterday at the Sustainable Investment Forum, you would never ask a doctor not to consider an MRI. This is important data. They don't make a diagnosis without looking at the data. And this is where investors are. We need to understand the most important risks and opportunities to make good investment decisions. It's consistent with fiduciary duty. And so these bills are really restricting investors' freedom to invest responsibly. And I would say that's what I'm hearing. is investors are standing up and saying, don't restrict my ability to do my job on behalf of my clients and beneficiaries. So a growing trend. We have investors and companies signing on to this campaign, Freedom to Invest. And I do think that there's going to be, if the campaign continues, it's a political campaign. It's almost what we would say called political theater, and not really going to have a chilling effect. I do think we've seen one of our asset managers withdraw from NZAM for those political reasons, but the vast majority are staying in. And in fact, even in the US, the numbers of signatories are growing. More and more investors are recognizing that they have to make these commitments, they have to set targets, they have to issue their climate action plans to really address the risk that's critical to the portfolio. So I'm not anxious about it. We do, of course, we're facing the inquiry from Congress. NZAM and the CA 100 Plus initiative have both been asked to respond with documents. We've handed over hundreds of thousands of documents. There's no litigation because there's no problem. The reason they haven't filed lawsuits against asset managers or against the initiatives is there's no evidence of antitrust. So we really do think this should be seen in a political light, and we should just stay the course, get the messaging right. We need the freedom to invest responsibly. We need to continue the hard work of addressing these risks across the portfolio. And where we see bad bills coming, we're going to be asking investors and to stand up and say, no, don't restrict our right to do our jobs.
That makes perfect sense. Maybe just two more words from you on, I hadn't heard of this Freedom to Invest kind of, I guess, is it a movement? Is it an initiative? Is this something that is formalized?
I'm sorry, Kelly. You broke up a little bit, and I'm sure it's the connection on my side, but it's freedomtoinvest.org. Lots more information on that website.
Perfect. Kirsten just threw that in the chat, so that's great. Let's move over to Thomas to talk a little bit more on the nature side of things, that first trend I mentioned. As I said, the TNFD launched this week, and it's very much putting nature in the spotlight. What does this mean in practice for investors? There's a lot of parallels to the TCFD, but I know also some important differences. Do you see these frameworks as very similar and expect them to roll out similarly, or are there going to be differences in your point of view?
Yes, to all of that, I would say, look, this is accelerating a long overdue discussion. If we think that emission and climate issues are material, well, wait until we start looking properly into nature issues. Look, if you look at some of our major economic systems, we've got a food system that's around $10 trillion today. We have the whole material space of $5 trillion. We've got the whole tourism industry of around $10 trillion. Nature is a pretty important factor of production in our economy. And as investors, in the same way that we would puzzle and muse over employment data coming out, interest rates going up or down, so too should we be scrutinizing when there's insights as to evolutions or risks to another one of our factors of production, which is nature. Nature is a productive asset in the same way that our factories and plants are. And as Kirsten mentioned, we need to understand that it is material to so many business models from the risk and the opportunity side. Yes, I think TNFD will be similar in many ways to the TCFD. It's intentionally designed in that way to replicate all the good learnings there. I think therefore there's an opportunity to leapfrog, to accelerate a little bit. We already see this in Nature Action 100, which was announced immediately as the TNFD is coming out. We've got this major engagement initiative coming out, which I'm sure will also replicate all of the evolutions from Climate Action 100. More broadly, what I would say on nature, what's perhaps most exciting to us, or what we're doing a lot of thinking on our side, is recognizing that this is not just about embedding thinking around nature in all of our traditional asset classes. We believe nature itself should increasingly be seen as its own asset class. If you're looking at some of the financing requirements and the financing opportunities there, Out of COP15, we had a target of 1 billion hectares being restored or returned to nature, whether that's in the agricultural space or otherwise. That requires very new financing models. Nature finance is something that we're incredibly excited about. We believe nature finance is today very nascent. It is in a state where finance in renewable infrastructure might have been 10 to 15 years ago. We think there's tremendous opportunities there. We think there's real financing opportunities, revenue streams to be developed, but it really requires thinking of nature as an asset class in the same way that we might today think about real estate in our portfolios.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Thomas. Very interesting points on the financing mechanisms that are needed for nature. Now that we have the disclosure, I think it's time that we start looking at those mechanisms. And I know this is a big thing that will be happening at Building Bridges. So for those of you who will be in Geneva, there's several sessions on that. Dan, I wanted to come back to the regulation piece because we know, Christian put some nuances on that point as well, but we know that now the EU has really rolled out a lot of its SFDR and is now starting to go back to the industry and ask for further input on how it's going. There's some confusion over the classifications. And I think in general, this just points to the reality of when we're building something new, there's going to be some iteration. What are your views on how we should approach this? It's not going to be perfect the first try, but are there ways to reduce unnecessary confusion and difficulty? And do you think strong regulation helps you to be more competitive in the space and to take the action that's needed?
There's a lot of questions in there. I'll try and remember them all as I talk. I mean, firstly, in terms of the strong regulation, I mean, we support regulation, and I do think it's been helpful, as I touched on earlier. I've been involved in sustainability in some shape or form for more than 20 years, and actually, in the last couple of years, I can really see the difference that the regulation is having. The greenwashing or anti-greenwashing, focus has helped. It's made everybody has to be much more precise with their language and be much clearer about what we actually mean. There was a lot of aspirational language, let's describe it like that, in the past. I don't think it was intentionally misleading, but probably aspirational, and I think that has to stop because it's just causing confusion. But linked to that, then you have to have this, again, Christian touched on it, we have to be clear about what we mean. What does net zero actually mean? We can all be saying net zero, or we use these same terms, and actually we mean different things. So that's where regulation really helps to start to standardize. Turning to SFDR specifically, actually, if I take it up a level to the sustainable finance kind of as a package, it makes a lot of sense if you look at it from the taxonomy and you look at SFDR and then you look at CSRD, for example, it's coming in next year. I think personally, if they'd come out at different times and perhaps in a different order, we might be in a slightly different position. We're next year asking companies to disclose information, which the year before we were asking investors to disclose when they had no information to disclose because the taxonomy wasn't completed. So it's all a bit backward. So I think as we go forward, I think that will settle down because we will start to have better data, better clarification, and better disclosure. I think, again, as we all know, SFDR has been a bit of a bumpy ride, let's describe it like that. There are some inconsistencies within the way it's constructed, within some of the concepts, and there has been a drip feed of guidance and clarification, which has been difficult. I mean, from my own perspective, we've, I think, I forget the number, it's about 60 or 80 funds who are in scope for at least Article 8 or 9. And it's been hard trying to keep on track of that, the pre-contractual documents, the website disclosures, the periodic reports, trying to understand what's required. And we've also seen this variation as well between the different regulators. So the CSSF in Lux might say one thing, whereas a CBI in Ireland will say a slightly different thing, which makes it really difficult for us. And then if you think about it, this was designed as ultimately to provide clarity and transparency. Well, if the regulators are telling us to do the same things based on the same regulation, then that's not going to provide the clarity and the transparency that I think is intended. So anyway, there are some clear challenges. I think the new consultation is interesting. It's only came out this week, but essentially, on the one hand, they're recognizing that SFDR is being used as a labeling scheme, which is obviously they've been very clear that it's not, but the industry has been using it as if it's a label. So they seem to be recognizing that. And my view of what they're suggesting is to try and tackle that head on. They're basically saying, do we just start again with a new labeling scheme, or do we build on what we've got already, but potentially lose the classification of Article 8 and 9? And I hope they build. That will be my preference, that they reframe it and they build on what's already there. And I can see the logic of having a labeling scheme. Whether we actually keep them separate, we still have a disclosure aspect, but it's complementary to a labeling scheme, remains to be seen. But I think the consultation direction of travel is positive. There were two areas that I always felt were missing from SFDR. One was the concept of transition, which is not really clearly defined in SFDR, or at least it almost directs capital to activities, whether it's a company or a real asset, which is already sustainable, not necessarily on the journey to being sustainable. That's something that's in the consultation. So I think clarifying that and allowing that transition is really important, because I think, and this is where, coming back to my earlier point about maturity, I think that everyone is now realizing that transition is a really, really important part. We have to have transition. We have to work with companies, collaborate and engage and move them on that journey. And that takes time, but also it needs to direct capital to those kind of activities. What we don't want is everyone directing capital to all the same activities, pushes the value up, and actually it just doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't have that real world impact. So I think transition is positive. And then there are some, without getting into the details of it, but there are some idiosyncrasies around the principal adverse indicators and how they work and how it's constructed, particularly when you look at what you say at an entity level versus what you do and say at a product level. So I think the consultation hopefully will resolve some of those. So overall, I think it's positive, but I think it remains to be seen where it goes from here.
Makes sense. Building the plane a little bit as we fly it. So I'm going to go to Christian for one more question before I open up to these great audience questions that are coming in. So Christian, this is the second time I've done this webinar of the trends. And last year we were seeing the GFANs were rolling out. There was a lot on climate. This year there's this rise of nature, both environmentally focused topics. Do you think the S and the G are being underestimated? Of course, we know all these factors are interlinked. Is there a risk of focusing too much on one of them? And how do you see these other ones coming together?
Good question. Well, first of all, as you said, all three factors, ESG, are kind of, from my perspective, three variables of the function, mathematically speaking, of the function sustainability. So they are strongly interconnected, sure. But so we have to look at them together. Of course, the factor climate, I would say, is super present 24/7, right in our face. I mean, if we watch TV, I mean, climate is present, yeah. So no escape, and it's highly present in the public discussion. But if we look into the corporate world, what is really crucial when we want to move the E and the S, we need the G. The G is here, it's super crucial, because adequate governance and transparency are kind of prerequisites for us to move forward at the end of the day on the issue of environment or nature. So governance means, how do we govern? How do we steer our share towards the transitional process? First of all, step one, do we have a basic conviction in the company? How do we contribute to the transition? B, are we aware of the key levers we have, for example, as an investment house to deliver here? 3, if yes, what are the goals? Top down, from the BOD level to the operative level. Yeah, which committees are important? Which committees do we need? What are the roles and responsibilities of the different committees, of the different units? So that's quite important. We need a governance in place. And if you look, if you meet investors, institutional investors, for example, if you meet rating agencies, if you meet analysts, what is a key question? How do you govern the transition in your house? That's a key question. And appropriate governance basically is the proof in the pudding that you are able to deliver your share. On the other side, quite an important aspect is in terms of governance. I mean, what could be realistically a role of an investment house or of a member of our industry in terms of to deliver its share to the transition? A lot of stakeholders, to be honest, overestimate what we can deliver. Sure, we can deliver we can steer our operations, we can build a CO2 reduction path, yeah. We can educate our relationship managers, we can offer the adequate solutions towards our clients, but at the end of the day, our clients decide. That's a really important topic. Yeah. And still a lot of people just put a lot of expectations to our industry. Yeah. But we need to, and that's in a governance aspect, we need to be really transparent what we can deliver. Yeah. Otherwise, some stakeholders will be frustrated, and we need to avoid it. Yeah. And that has to do with our dialogue with the regulators, with the politicians, yeah, and with our key stakeholders. Because I feel a lot of dedication and a lot of energy in our industry to move forward. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. I am going to start taking a couple questions from the chat here. I'm going to start with Thomas. There's a really interesting one here on nature. And of course, other panelists chime in after Thomas gives it the first go. Do you see the return drivers? This is on nature as an asset class. So if we're looking at that topic, do you see the return drivers being from traditional markets derived from sustainably managed natural capital, such as timber, wood markets, or agriculture commodities? Or do you see the asset class more in terms of restoring and protecting nature, and the return drivers being more from the ecosystem service markets like carbon and biodiversity credits, or a combination?
Thank you for the question. Really grateful for you asking it. And indeed, the answer is a combination, and that's what's driving the excitement. Look, there have always been available revenue streams in nature around the generation of various commodities, whether it is timber or honey or coffee or almonds or other commodities. What is new today are two things. We are seeing, on the one hand, the food system as being perhaps most exposed to climate risks, and there's becoming a real resilience question in supply chains, which will drive a degree of capital into those supply chains and perhaps a willingness to invest in resilience. That's one. Secondly, we today have the emergence of new environmental markets that includes markets around carbon. It includes biodiversity credits. What's exciting about this is if you take degraded land today, and there's plenty of degraded land, 1/3 of all of our agricultural land is degraded. You can buy it as an investor at a discount. You can regenerate it, whether it's through regenerative agriculture or agroforestry. In the process, you're benefiting from land appreciation, you're generating revenue streams from the commodities you might extract from it, you're earning carbon credits and biodiversity credits, and actually as part of the new FLAG guidance that I think was mentioned earlier, you're starting to find people in the downstream part of the value chain looking for offtake within their supply chain, trying rather than to offset emissions somewhere else outside of the supply chain, they're looking to couple the sourcing of commodities with actual more carbon positive attributes. So what we're seeing today is the emergence of new markets, the resilience question coming to the fore, new frameworks developing that's really shifting the economics of nature as an asset class.
Great, thanks for that comprehensive answer, Thomas, and the example. I really appreciate that. I think it makes it more, lands it for us in our heads. Kirsten, I'm going to come back to you. You kind of written an answer, but I do think that this is one that I'd love for everyone to make sure they've heard. We got a question from Georgie on the trends around impact measurement in the context of the trends discussed. So how are you seeing impact measurements develop? And I know I think it was Thomas spoke about the 90s, we were exclusion, and we've been moving, and I think we're moving towards that impact space. So how are you seeing the impact measurement piece developing?
Yeah, I mean, we're watching closely the ISSB consultation, and I think there will be an emerging sense of a shift, that we're no longer looking at what's a material risk to one company. That's no longer the way to think about these issues, but to think about sustainability as an issue that affects the entire real economy and the entire portfolio for most universal investors. So I think with that shift, impact has to include systemic risks. So things like climate, it's not just about will climate impact your business, but how will your business impact climate and therefore affect everything in the economy. So I think that impact measurement becomes pretty focused. It's still on what's financially material. That's the critical measure for, I think, investors. We talk about investable data. They want to see from companies not metrics about how much good they're doing in the world in an abstract way, but how their impact is going to result in long-term value creation for the investor. So I think still a focus on materiality, but a broader definition to include systemic impacts. I did also just want to highlight GRI is what I think has emerged as the best standard for broad-based disclosure. And with GRI reports, we see measurements that will not only be useful to investors, but to other stakeholders as well, to communities, to employees, to all of the other parties who care about what a company is doing.
Great. I'm not sure if there's someone from one of the big investment folks here who would like to also chime in on this, because I think for a long time, impact was really looked at as this boutique thing. We've seen, for example, the acquiring of some boutique investment houses. One here in Switzerland was Blue Orchard and Schroders. But I'm curious of how for example, Dan Aberdeen, how you're looking at the impact piece within your business.
Yeah, I was actually going to come in, so that was a nice segue. And I think your intro was right; is like spot on. Like impact a few years ago was kind of fairly niche, I suppose. And I think what's happened is it started to come more into the mainstream in terms of the measurement of impact and the understanding of impact. And you see more and more of this language of sort of double materiality is starting to come from a regulatory perspective as well, where you understanding the financial materiality, but also the impact on to people and planet, or the materiality to people and planet. So you're starting to see that, and I think we're also, there is the impact management project did this sort of the ABC framework a few years ago. So avoiding harm, benefiting stakeholders and contributing to solutions. This was kind of the impact framework, and I think that's kind of evolved. You kind of got ESG integration as your sort of starting point, and then you move to sustainable outcomes, and then out into sort of spectrum and out into impact and beyond. But I think that sustainable outcomes area is quite broad now. SFDR kind of recognizes that as well, and understanding the impact of your investments, both from a financial perspective, but more broadly is becoming certainly more language you see more. But again, as we've touched on a few times, it's still new, and understanding what impact is, identifying the correct data points and how to measure that in a consistent way is still evolving. But I think the fact that the conversation is taking us in that way, and we recognize that there is this sort of starting point of integration, and then you kind of looking to identify a sustainable outcome or impact is a positive move.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. Christian, there's a question in the chat that I think it was asked before you gave your intervention, but it's asking about the client. And you mentioned ultimately the client makes the decision. This is certainly a reason we've focused on bringing more asset owners to Building Bridges. But I do think it's a symbiotic relationship, and there's things that financial institutions can do to help their clients to get there. So the question here is, what would be the priorities for financial institutions to accelerate the shift towards capital allocation in sustainable products from an investment perspective with their clients?
I think, how do you start? Basically, the key duty is, and what we do, just besides the regulatory requirements, MiFID, etc., what you do, you talk to the clients in terms of, okay, what are the opportunities and risks of ESG or of this whole transitional process? That's the first thing you do. Okay. So you educate the client, and then you offer the client different kind of vehicles, how, if he would like to do, how he can participate in the transitional process. That could be a fund, that could be whatever, an advisory mandate or whatever. So you need to talk with him about the vehicles for him, which we have in place. Yeah, if we would like to invest, what if it's an impact product or whatever. And then, you go from that.
And are there some of the things written in the question as well? Is there education that can be done with clients beyond, I think, what you've outlined there as well on the sustainability side?
Yeah, sure. You offer the client seminars, you offer individual, education is, a lot of clients are quite aware of the transitional process, and a lot of clients are quite knowledgeable of the process. Yeah, so they approach us with very specific questions. Yeah, and if there are clients who are not aware of the actual developments in this universe, you educate the clients, you talk to them. Yeah. So that's one of the basic tasks of an investment house, of an advisor, of a relationship manager. Yeah, that's the nature of our duties. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Christian. Thomas, this was also had your name on it, so curious if you have any comments to add there.
Well, thank you. Yes, I come back to my earlier point about a bit of a change in mindset. Look, I think where a lot of the trepidation maybe from clients comes from is the idea, gosh, this is something really different from what we've ever done before. Investing in transition, taking forward-looking views, taking non-financial factors into account. Is that really what we're about to do? Really, I think what we need to realize here, that transition in the economy has been the norm throughout the history of society rather than the exception. We've seen 3 agricultural revolutions, we're on the cusp of a 4th one. If we look at the energy system, over the last 200 years, we've moved from chopping down forests as our source of energy to coal, which, by the way, you could argue was a sustainability revolution. We moved from coal to oil and gas, which in turn was, by the way, a more functional source of energy, easier to transport, but also actually helped save our cities from air pollution. Now we're moving to yet another transition driven by superior economics, a more functional form of energy, and ultimately much more cleaner, which is renewable energy. But the idea that we haven't seen technology transitions before, that move us to a more productive economic model, that move us progressively to cleaner economic models, is nothing new. So we need to understand, I think, and do a little bit of homework as to the nature of system change, what drives system changes, how we can assess the likely direction of travel that policy will go into, that technology will go into, and we need to, I think, educate ourselves a little bit as to what we can learn from past lessons and apply that to this next sustainability revolution.
Great. Thank you so much, Thomas. So to wrap up, we have 5 minutes left. And so I want to do kind of a rapid fire round that's a little bit different, and just get each of you, I'm going to give you a second to think about it, each of you to tell me one topic or issue that's not so popular or on the agenda right now, but that you're starting to think about or that has piqued your interest. And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to tell you a couple that are getting raised at Building Bridges that I think are interesting because they're a little bit out of the box. So one is peace finance. So thinking about how both investors' portfolios are potentially affected by conflict, but also how their investments can affect instability and conflict as well. Another one that's quite interesting at Building Bridges that we've seen coming up is the concept of post-growth. So the EU recently held a conference on beyond growth and is looking at the fact that we do live on a finite planet. What happens in a world where we can't grow, especially in an industry that's predicated on alphas and getting growth? So that's another one that's quite interesting. There's some things around innovative health financing in emerging markets. These are some of the topics at Building Bridges that we're seeing that are a little bit out of the box. So I'm curious for each of you, if there's a topic that's got your interest that's maybe not nature or climate, but that's starting to come on your radar. Anyone want to volunteer to go first? Kirsten, go ahead. Ladies first.
Sure. I can jump in and say that as I'm beginning to look at investors' plans for proxy season 24, I do think we're going to see some emphasis on plastics. And this is an interesting sort of new area of work. It's a focus on supply chain, and it's an extension, I think, of some of the work on climate, but of course directly impacts water and nature as well. I wanted to just nuance one of the other trends that you raised in the beginning about disclosure, and we've talked quite a bit about taxonomies, but I want to note that I think there's a new move to see more mandatory disclosure, and I just want to highlight that for a European audience, what might be still invisible, there's a new California law coming. 2 bills passed last week, one requiring TCFD disclosures from big companies, and the other requiring scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions disclosure from large companies. I think both of those, the governor has indicated he will sign in the next couple weeks. So that shift from voluntary disclosure, I think now very robust. We're seeing lots of TCFD reports from companies necessary for investors, but to a mandatory framework. I'm not too worried that will be 1,000 different regulations. I think that this sends a signal, and we'll see the SEC in the US pick this up. And I think it is a continuation of some of the mandatory disclosure moves we're seeing around Europe and other parts of the world. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So the plastics and then this kind of voluntary to mandatory. Dan, what's the issue that's on your mind? Newer one.
So 2, I think. I mean, they're not new, but they're things we're thinking about. So the first is water, which is, to me, is kind of the next along. You've climate, nature, and actually everything comes back to water ultimately as well. The availability of water, the quality of water, and the potential loss of water availability. That's all going to affect, companies' ability to continue to operate, and so understanding that, how water is used, and really understanding that. So we're having quite a big focus on that, just to really understand that, because the data's just not there, and I don't think it's fully understood actually how. I mean, everyone understands how important water is, but I don't know if it's really understood how important water is. So that's one area, and then the other one is actually, it's not new, but it's coming from the regulation again, is supply chain and supply in Europe in particular, the new regulations on supply chain due diligence. If that does come through, I think that could be, again, quite transformational in really understanding supply chain risks and understanding where we sit within that and how interrelated we all are as well. Might be quite fascinating. But I think those 2 things for me are probably where, certainly where we're focusing our efforts at the moment.
Great. Christian, an issue that's got your attention.
Well, I just would mention 2 topics, not new, but we should have that definitely on our radar. First of all, just Dan mentioned it, data. It's data availability. When we talk about regulations, when we talk about taxonomy, when we talk about principal adverse impact, about the indicators, it's all about availability and reliability of data. That's a big topic for us. Yeah. Second one is just coming back to the net zero debate. I mean, when we talk about net zero, we need to talk about offsetting and removal. And then we have the discussion about the carbon credit market. Yeah, a highly unregulated market. Yeah, not talking about capacities in the market. Imagine our industry is starting to widely trying to offset remaining emissions with carbon credits. Whoops, yeah, we have a problem here. So that is, I think, a discussion we really need to dive into.
So data availability and carbon markets. Thomas, last word to you. Topic on your radar.
Gosh, I don't know where to begin. Let me give you one theme and one sort of approach answer. A theme that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, you've heard me touch on it, is food systems. I think a lot of what we've been speaking about today really comes together in food systems, from the nature disclosures that we've been talking about, to the need for data, to the actual fragility of the whole economic system. We believe it's one of the, I think, major portions of our economy that we don't spend enough time talking about. If we look at a current inflationary environment, just look how much of that is linked to food system. And that isn't just all political instability. A lot of that is also simply fragility of food systems. It's a great example of a space where you really need that system change, a really different way of doing business. In terms of mindset and how we're trying to restructure our thinking, we're also doing a lot of thinking, understanding how all of these transformations that we're thinking about really quite profoundly change the economic landscape. Not only, as I talked about earlier, the structure of GDP, for instance, but actually the characteristics of the economy. To give you one example, a lot of these transitions that we talk about involve transitions in very capex intensive business models that ultimately reduce your dependence on consumable fuels and other things, and ultimately move you to a world with fewer depleting assets. That really starts to fairly profoundly change the drivers of the economy, the macroeconomic factors we're exposed to. Potentially it starts to reduce volatility of things like the energy system, which really reverberates to other economic sectors. To really understand this, we really need to think critically what kind of skill sets we need to bring to the table to think through the implications on our portfolios.
Very interesting. Kirsten, Thomas, Dan, Christian, thank you so much for your inputs. Sorry, everyone, for keeping you 2 minutes over, but we really look forward to seeing you at Building Bridges for more of these types of discussions, and see you all very, very soon. Thank you, everyone.